Welcome to today's episode of Table Talk with
the Mercer County ESC.
All right, we are back for today's episode, and today we have Kurt Wendel.
Hi, Lindsay. How are you?
Kurt said that he was not ever going to come on our podcast,
and here I am.
And here he is. So in our last episode, we had Jen Bruns, and she talked about school financing. And we ended that podcast when she talked about the services that districts purchase. So today we're going to talk with Kurt. And before we get into today's discussions, Kurt, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Kurt Wendel, born and raised in Fort Recovery, never left. Got a bachelor's degree in accounting from Wright State and really wanted to do cost accounting in a factory my whole life, but the economy was doom and gloom. Ended up at Fort Recovery as their EMIS coordinator. Spent 10 years and 1 month at Fort Recovery Schools. Office was between the superintendent and treasurer, and really did a variety of things, anything from transportation director to EMIS coordinator to facilities, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and the likes.
Kurt.
So
jack of all trades.
Yeah, but it worked. Got some feelings in a lot of different areas and stuff, and then once you're 10 years vested in the state retirement system, they kind of own you. So
that's the whole reason you're here with us today.
Yeah. So, it's like, all right, let's do this thing. And, the next step seemed like treasure. So, Lori Cook was there and was doing great and spent a lot of time with me across those 10 years. But when the ESC job opened up, I'm like, yep, let's do this. So here I am today, 8+ years later. So
yes, now you get to work with all of us at the ESC.
It's a special place. So I love it. It's great.
It is. So today we're going to talk about the history of ESCs, what an ESC is. We'll talk about funding services, district agreements, and just all of that. We'll get into it.
Yeah. So, it says there, history of the ESCs. ESCs were boards of education when they were created way back in 1914. And they really were governing the schools. They oversaw the hiring of those districts. They approved the budgets. They approved the curriculum. They really were governing bodies of the counties, and that's why every county had one of 88 of us. Today, we are still the Mercer County Board of Education, if you ask the IRS. But in the mid-90s, state legislators decided it was time for that to shift more to the local districts. And at that point in time, they created what are now Educational Service Centers, us ESCs. Also in the mid-90s, they said, if you have less than 16,000 students in your county, we're going to force you to merge. For us in this part of Ohio, Bob Cupp was a very influential individual down at the State House at that point in time and said, that'll work in the state of Ohio, but it just probably is not going to work in my area. And that's why you still see a lot of individual county ESCs around us where they've been forced to merge elsewhere. Today, there's down to 51 of us, partially because of that forced merger and partially because when the state made this transition to educational service centers, we really became more competitive in nature as organizations. Because now districts can buy those services that we're out there providing from anyone. Mm-hmm. So, you see a little bit more competition amongst us, even though in the state's eyes, we are public schools. So, we work here at a public school, but we have no students. So it's a really unique, diverse job. What else transpired across the years then when the pandemic hit in 2020 is that us ESCs as a whole, with 51 of us left, really started working more together. And I think you're obviously a part of that with our connection with Brown County. I wouldn't have been able to tell you where Brown County, Ohio was before the pandemic, but here we are partnering with them on a number of projects and stuff.
Right.
Now. So it's gotten a little more interesting and we're working together a little more. We are governed by a board of education like a normal school district would. Shelley and I answer to 5 board members who are elected officials. So in Mercer County, those individuals come from our local districts. So cities and exempted villages, we'll talk a little bit more about how they're different later. But Marion, St. Henry, Fort Recovery, and Parkway are the individuals that vote on and can be represented on our board currently. So currently, we have two from Fort Recovery and one from Parkway, one from St. Henry, and one from Marion Local that make up our 5-person board currently. So, um, and so if you talk about that district alignment, then, you know, we talk about cities and exempted villages and locals. State law states that cities and exempted villages can pick their ESC of desire every single year. They have to make a decision by December and it goes into effect in July. The locals only get the right to do that every 2 years, and that's why we have decided that our board will be made up of those locals because the city and exempted villages can jump any year. So that is that. And then that's, I think, all I got for the history of ESCs, unless you have questions.
No, I don't think so. Do you do you want to explain really what an educational service center is?
I think I can explain what the Mercer County ESC is.
Yeah,
But when we talk about ESCs in general, the makeup of the ESC is so different based on the districts that they serve.
that's a really good point. We
Um,
are much different than some of the other
yes,
ESCs.
and I think that is one of the struggles that we deal with as an ESC and being employees of an ESC is that, you know, a lot of people in the public don't know who we are, which a lot of us that work here think that's a great thing. You know, we can just do the good things for the schools behind the scenes
Mhm.
and be out of the eye. But whether that ends up coming back and being a bad thing is when we go to the state legislator about the budget and about funding options and revenues and stuff like that. They're like, well, we're not sure what you do.
Mhm.
And that's because there's 51 of us doing very different things depending on who they're reporting to. For an example, Fort Recovery and St. Henry and Rushi all share a special education director. They don't need that full time person all day, every day because of their size and their makeup and how they do things internally. Where if we went to the city of Columbus, they would be lost and confused saying they don't have a special ed director that answers all day, every day right there in house. So when you compare us to any of the rurals versus the urbans, we're providing totally different services than any of the big guys that we would call. So in house here, the biggest part of our makeup is going to be special education services for expense wise, and that's where the majority of our employees are. We employ about 110 employees here. But if you walk around our office building, you're only going to see probably maybe 15, maybe 20 on a busy day in here because our employees are really out doing that service in the district with the kids.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we also, we go all the way from the special education side of high needs and disabilities and stuff all the way to the other end of the spectrum and providing gifted services to the districts. Preschool education. We do all the preschool education for special education services for all 6 county schools and Versailles now. Um, and then we get into some specialty areas that, based on our makeup, based on the rural nature, small size of our districts, speech therapy, psychs, OT, and PT services are things that our districts don't have a need typically to have a full time one in those positions. So we can hire the individuals here and bill it accordingly to whatever their needs are for that year.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. All right, Kurt, you did talk a little bit about how ESCs are different depending on where they're at. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of ESCs and the district alignment because you did mention that a little bit. So let's go more in depth on that.
Correct. So when we talk about alignment, really the only thing that is impacting is state aid. So ESCs get a little bit of state aid based on the number of students that are aligned to them. State law states that you have to, as a district, send $6.50 per pupil to the ESC to help them with their overall overhead cost. Doesn't mean you have to buy any services from them. Doesn't mean you can't buy all your services from them. All the alignment piece is talking about is a little bit of state aid to help offset the cost. Now, each ESC is a little different. We as an ESC give our aligned districts then some complementary services that if another district calls us, we're going to charge them for. Um,
What would be an example of that?
one thing that I get involved in is if a district is looking to hire a new treasurer, or Shelley, if they're looking to hire a new superintendent, they're not paying us to provide that service. Shelley and I will
Got
help
it.
organize that entire search, assist their board in any way they desire us to help them. Um, we do CPI training, van driver trainings, and items like that. All of our network meetings with gathering all the superintendents together, or treasurers together, or principals together, guidance counselors, special ed directors. We organize all them networking meetings and get all that information ready and for them, complimentary if they're in a line district. But like I said, doesn't mean they have to buy any services from us.
Mhm.
One example would be, fortunately, our aligned districts are relatively loyal to us for purchasing services. But one that comes right to mind is education audiologist. If a student is hearing impaired, fortunately, we do not have a large number of students that's impacting in our districts. So it doesn't make sense for them to buy that service from us because we can't do it as cost effectively as someone else. So
Mhm.
all of our aligned districts currently are using Montgomery County ESC out of Dayton, who has a good network of education audiologists and has the staff for that to buy those services from.
Got it.
Um, as a rule of thumb, Shelly and I's rule is, I mean, we have to provide good services, but they have to be cost effective good services, because we're looking at it from the perspective of that district.
Mhm.
If they can do it just as cheap or just as the same price as us, then it doesn't make sense for them to buy it from us. So we have to be cost effective and providing good services at the same time. We talked a little bit earlier about the structure of an ESC and how we have a 5-person board of education that governs us as an organization. But I frequently tell districts that while they are the people that vote and keep us organized here as a whole, my bosses really are the superintendents and treasurers of the districts that are buying our services.
Mhm.
Because if they're not happy and we're not providing good product for them, none of us are going to have a job here. It doesn't really matter what that board of education says at the end of the day. So onward about purchasing services and stuff, one of the districts there is Waynesfield Goshen. I always use as my example. Great district, but really rural, small, maybe 450 total students, K 12. They're buying services from 5 different ESCs.
Mhm.
Part of that is geography, where they're located out there, and part of that is the services that they need. Where it makes the most sense to get it from at
Mhm.
a cost effective and good product. So,
Yeah. Um, I was just thinking, so district alignment, how does that work?
so, like I said earlier, the cities and exempted villages can choose which ESC they're going to align with every single year. They have to decide by December 31st and take board action on it, and it goes into effect July 1 to June 30.
Okay.
So if there's any surprise movement or anything, an ESC has that 6-month window to be prepared for what is potentially
Got it.
coming or not coming. Um, and local district only gets that option every 2 years. So they would have that option in even and odd years or whatever it may be. And then it does the 6-month window as well. But it's always December 31st.
Okay. All right, Kurt. So we talked about fully aligned structures. Let's talk about the funding. So the funding for ESCs. So up here we have some statistics. So could you just talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, we're right around the 105 to 110 employees. But where we talked about most of those are direct service individuals. So we get just a little bit of funding from the state of Ohio to help cover our overhead, but the bulk of our finances is coming from billing the districts for the services we're providing them. So if you look there, $9.5 million was spent last fiscal year. 1.5 of that was COVID related. Those grants were working their way through and are now finished. So when you're looking at spending $8 million of general fund money and only getting $500,000 from the state of Ohio, we are directly driven on billing the districts for the services we provide them. So out of those 105 employees currently, it says there we got 41 teachers and 43 classroom aides. So a lot of times ESC staff in the public's eye ends up getting viewed as district staff, which in my opinion is a great thing. It means we have blended right into their culture, we've blended right into their environment.
Mhm.
When I was at Fort Recovery for those 10 years, Stacy Fowler was a regular in that elementary building. Lo and behold, she's never spent one day employed by Fort Recovery Local Schools. She's always been a Mercer County ESC employee.
That's
Um,
so funny because I worked at Marion and Wendy was an employee there. I never knew that she was hired through the ESC.
Correct. And that's from now myself spending 8 years here. That is my ultimate goal.
Mhm.
Is that they really get embedded into that culture and stuff. And it's nothing about them. They can't really, I mean, they're always going to have the option to buy services. We're only going to provide services they need, but that is the ultimate goal, especially when it comes to the population of kids we're typically serving in those units out in the special ed units. If we can get the teachers and the staff to be embedded in that culture, it's just that much smoother of a transition with those kids and everything. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So, um, I don't know. You see some ADM numbers off to the right there. That is average daily membership. So what that is what typically a district would refer to as their enrollment. ADM is just the fancy number that the state gives it. Um, you see it goes out to the 100th of a decimal place. That is based on, a kid can attend multiple places. So around here, the easiest way to describe that is TriStar. So if a junior or senior from one of those districts is attending TriStar, TriStar might be getting like 43% or 51% of that kid's funding. And that's how you end up going out to 100th of a decimal place there.
Okay.
Any district that has less than 16,000 students must be aligned to an ESC. That's per law. That's also where that number of 16,000 for a county back in the day came from. But every district in the state of Ohio is aligned to an ESC except one, and it is Toledo
Toledo.
Public.
Yeah.
Toledo Public is the only one that is not aligned to an ESC currently. And the laws have since changed a little bit, and I think they're kind of stuck on an island. So,
All right, Kurt, we talked a lot about ESCs. Um, and before we log off today, could you just share where people could learn more about ESCs?
as an organization as a whole, we are part of the statewide network referred to as OESCA, the Ohio Educational Service Center Association, who has a great website out there and stuff. And then obviously we have our own website that's full of information. One of the things I utilize maybe the most on our website is our staff directories on there and has the photos and stuff and whatnot. So I'm sure people could log in there and find people they're going to know and be like, wow, I had no idea that they were a Mercer County ESC employee and not a Coldwater Schools employee or a Fort Recovery Schools employee.
Yeah, and we'll just give Renee Whistler a shout out because Renee basically maintains the website and she does a phenomenal job of keeping it up to date. Um, so yeah, all right. Well, thank you for joining us today, Kurt.
Yes, no problem. Thank you.